On an evening very much like the one we're experiencing, where there was a big full moon, this time of year, I was leaving the administration building of a college that I was teaching at. It was an evening class, a class that I had done so many times before. And I had a audience that was not excited about sitting in a classroom for 90 minutes listening to relatively technical and dry material, but they needed it to graduate. What they didn't realize is that I was as unmotivated about going into that class as they were. And as I left the administration building with the number 10 envelope that had been in my mailbox that gave me the classroom assignment for that term, I wasn't feeling very good about it either. You see, for the previous 8 or 9 terms that I had taught this class, I was in an old classroom building. And the general condition of the building was poor. The classroom itself was uncomfortable, too cold in the winter, too hot in the spring. It had a lot of noise from a nearby road. The furniture was old. The tiles were coming up off the floor, and the lighting was poor. So you can understand as a professor how that doesn't really enhance the learning experience. And so as I walked across the quad, I reached into my jacket pocket. I took out my assignment document and oh my God, I had been assigned to a brand new classroom building that had just been dedicated 3 weeks before. And I'd never been in the building since the dedication, but that was exciting in and of itself. So I changed my direction, went over to the building, and I stood there in front of it. 3 stories. It sparkled. It was glass on the outside, and the inside looked so inviting. I stepped into the lobby and was still impressed. I could only imagine what the classrooms themselves were like. And I went up to my classroom on the 3rd floor, and I stepped in, and it was like nothing I possibly could have expected. It was beautiful. Everything was new. The furniture, the lighting was perfect. The boards were perfect. Everything about it was more than I could have possibly hoped for. And so I wrote on the blackboard, which actually was a white marker board. Quite remarkable. They didn't have many of those back then. And a script that I had picked up from a favorite author of mine, Dean Koontz, that I thought was inspiring to the students who would be filing in. That task done, I stepped across the hall to the men's lab. And in the lab, I was blown away again. It was like being inside a museum. It was a piece of art. The floors glimmered. The sinks were perfect. There wasn't a water spot on any of the mirrors. And when I got done washing my hands, I went over not to the paper dispensers, but the electric hand dryers. There were 4 of them that were up against the wall. And I hit the button, as all of you are familiar with, and put my hand underneath the nozzle. And while my hands were drying, I did something I had never done before. I read the little black tag that was attached to the white porcelain case. And the tag said, the XL electric hand dryer is better than paper towels. And it listed 3 bullets. Eliminates restroom clutter. Makes sense. Prevents the spread of infectious disease. Makes better use of our natural resources than turning trees into paper towels. Wow, I never would have thought of all those things. I was just blown away. It was a whole new perspective on something as fundamental as a hand dryer machine. And I came to a realization. I had gone into that classroom building that night full of anxiety and worry that, it was going to be just like it always was. But my trip to the restroom inspired me. And when I got back to my classroom, I erased the saying from Dean Koontz. And I wrote a saying that's also one of my favorites from President Harry Truman. The only thing worth learning are the things you learn after you know it all. And wow, that was a epiphany moment for me. And I reveled in it. And with that new moon overhead, I could see a bright future ahead. But that moment rang familiar with me. And I couldn't remember exactly what it was. So after class was over and I was leaving the building, I went and I sat in the quad and I thought about that. And I realized that I had had a similar experience in my younger years as a young child attending elementary school. Now, I come from a big Irish family. And guess where they send young Irish kids? The local parochial school that is run by religious sisters. And that was my fate. I was put into the school that our church had recently built. And the nuns from that religious order that were in charge of the school was an order called the Sisters of Mercy. I have no idea, where they got that name, because my first 2 years under the tutelage of the Sisters of Mercy were not merciful in any way, means, or form. And I was developing quite a negative opinion about them. And yes, I was a bit precocious, and I spoke out of turn, and I misbehaved from time to time. But, they were always right there with strict and sometimes painful discipline. And more often than not, I was held after class to sit in that classroom in detention. Now, going into the end of my second year, I learned something that terrified me and I knew was going to make my life pure hell. My father had come to a parent-teacher meeting, and he had discovered that for the 3rd grade, my teacher, who was also the principal, had also been his teacher in the 6th grade at St. Patrick's School across town. My goose was totally cooked. I knew I wasn't going to be able to get away with anything, because anything I did was going to go back to Dad, and anything that got back to Dad was going to have severe consequences. And I got very critical. I mean, after all, who were these women? They're so mysterious. They're draped head to toe in these silky black robes. All they had is a little portal where you could see their eyes, their nose, and their mouth. And you couldn't see if they had hair. Did they have hair or not? We had plenty of conversations on the playground about that. Yes, they had hands, and those hands were swift when it came to smacking you around or rapping you with one of their rulers. Did they have legs? I don't know. They moved, I think there were feet underneath it, but with those robes, who could tell? Were they really women? Or were there some kind of alien creature that was there to terrify us? That is the mindset that they had, in my mind, in terms of there's something I don't know about these women, and I've got to get to the root of it. At the end of my second grade, I noticed that across the street from the school, they were building a convent, and apparently they were going to move a couple dozen of these nuns into that convent building as their residence. Summertime came. We went out, enjoyed the summer, but I had this dread of what it was going to be like with Sister Mary Cecilia when I started third grade. And sure enough, when we came back in September, the convent building was done. The nuns had moved in. There was all of these nuns in that building. What could be more menacing? Now I'm thinking maybe it's some kind of a witch's coven. Maybe there is doing some kind of evil dance around a bonfire in the inside of that building. My imagination was running wild. My behavior wasn't perfect, and frequently with Sister Cecilia, I still found myself in detention at the end of the day. And I started watching the convent, and I noticed something peculiar. On Tuesday afternoons, after everybody else in the school had gone home except for the teachers that were watching the kids in detention, a green panel truck would drive up to the back of the convent, and a man would get out, and he'd go knock on the door, and they'd let him in. He'd be in there for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then he'd come back out. Well, when you're in the third grade and the only understanding you've got about how men and women work is from getting glimpses of your buddy's father's Playboy magazines that he stole away, I figured there was some hanky-panky going on in there. And so the following week, I was on detention again, and the green panel truck shows up, and the man goes inside. There is something definitely not right about this. So a couple days later, on an evening not too much different than tonight, where there was a full moon overhead, I was sitting out on my front porch with my buddy who lived next door. And I was telling him about the strange behavior I'm seeing going on at that convent, and how I really don't trust these nuns at all. There must be something that they're up to. And he said, well, what did the van look like? And I described it in detail because that's what third grade boys do. He said, well, that sounds like one of my father's vans. Your father? He has vans? Yeah. My dad has, several of them in his business. Well, what does your father do? Well, he has a commercial laundry business. I finally had the tidbit of information that I'd been lacking all along. The following day, when I looked back into the classroom, and Sister Mary Cecilia came walking down the hallway to me, I could look her straight in the eye because I now knew her secrets and the secrets of all those other religious sisters living in that building. And the secret was, I now knew nuns have dirty habits. Thank you.